It started on an ordinary Thursday morning, the kind where the sky still wore the color of sleep and the streets lay half asleep under a shroud of cool mist. I had just clipped the leash onto Max, my golden retriever, who practically vibrated with excitement. We took our usual path, down Sycamore Lane, past the shuttered cafe, and toward the edge of Rosewood Park. The world was still waking up. I wasn't expecting anything more than a quiet stroll, maybe a few glances from fellow dog walkers. That's when I saw him. He was leaning against the low iron fence that bordered the park, dressed in running gear that somehow looked deliberately careless. His dark hair was swept back, damp with sweat, and he had that effortless kind of poise, like the world moved just a little slower around him. He held a leash, too, at the end of which sat a stocky black lab who gave Max an eager bark. My dog, never one to resist a new friend, bolted forward. I stumbled to keep my grip and ended up nearly shoulder to shoulder with a stranger. "Sorry," I said, breathless. "He's friendly. Too friendly, really." The man smiled, eyes catching the weak sunlight in a way that made my pulse hiccup.
"So is she," he replied.
"Bella's a hopeless flirt." We both laughed, quick, nervous. It should have ended there. A brief exchange, a polite nod, then back to our lives. But Max and Bella had other plans. They twisted their leashes, circled us, demanded attention. And we gave in. "I'm Jamie," I offered, once it was clear our dogs weren't about to part ways. "Elias," he said, adjusting his grip on the leash. There was something in the way he said it, a slight hesitation, as if he wasn't used to introducing himself. We began walking together, our dogs trotting ahead like they'd been lifelong companions. The conversation came easily, light at first, dipping into deeper waters only when silence threatened. Elias worked odd hours, freelance architecture. I taught literature at a local community college. He'd moved to the neighborhood 3 months ago. I'd lived here 5 years, in the same small house with ivy that grew too fast and walls that remembered too much. By the time we reached the pond, I realized we hadn't stopped talking. There was something magnetic about him, not just his looks, though they were undeniably striking. It was the way he listened, how he spoke like each word had weight, but never felt heavy. I found myself hoping Max would keep wandering in circles just to stretch the moment longer. "Same time tomorrow?" Elias asked as we lingered near the water. I nodded, maybe too quickly. "Definitely." And so it began. The next morning, he was already there when I arrived. And the morning after that. We carved a rhythm into the waking hours, half-hour walks that became full hours, small talk that turned to long confessions. I learned he had once lived in Berlin, that he designed memorial spaces for clients who wanted beauty woven into grief, that he hated coriander and couldn't stand the smell of bleach. I told him about my failed engagement years ago, about how I had slowly rebuilt a quiet life. I didn't tell him how often I thought about him when he wasn't around. That felt dangerous. Still, the pull between us deepened, unspoken but electric. The way his eyes lingered a second too long. The brush of his hand when we reached for the same leash. The occasional text sent hours after the walk had ended. Did Max get his nap? Bella's passed out like she ran a marathon. Little things innocent enough on the surface. But there was something else, too. A flicker of tension I couldn't name. Some days, Elias was fully present, warm, engaged, open. Other times, he was distracted, checking his phone, glancing over his shoulder as if someone might be watching. Once, I asked if everything was okay. He smiled and said, "Of course," but the smile didn't reach his eyes. I told myself not to read into it. People had their own lives, their own ghosts. It wasn't my place to ask more. And yet, I couldn't stop the questions from blooming inside me. Who was Elias when I wasn't looking? Then, one morning, he didn't show up. I waited for 15 minutes. Then 20. Max sat by the fence, tail thumping hopefully, but there was no sign of Bella, no lean figure in running shoes. I texted him. No reply. The next day, the same. On the third day, a message finally arrived.
"Hey. Sorry.
Been busy with work stuff. Back soon, I promise."
Short. Vague.
Unlike him. I tried to believe it, told myself not to overthink. But something had shifted. I felt it like a stone in my chest. And that's when I realized this wasn't just some morning habit anymore. It was something more. Something I had quietly allowed to matter. That was the beginning of it. Not just of a connection I hadn't expected, but of the unraveling of everything I thought I understood about chance, trust, and the people we let into our quiet routines. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to be pulled into a story that was far messier, far deeper than I was prepared for. It started morning without Elias Thursday morning, like the others, the kind where the sky still wore the color of sleep, tinged with an edge of disappointment. I tried hard to ignore. Max, I had just clipped the leash onto Max, my golden retriever. I followed, practically vibrated with excitement. Partly, we took our usual path. I wasn't ready to give up the possibility that Elias might shuttered cafe, but the bench toward the edge of Rosewood It was empty. The world was still waking up, colder than the air warranted. I wasn't expecting anything more than a quiet stroll. I found myself scrolling through our messages from fellow dog walkers, rereading his short replies. That's when I saw him. Each one he was leaning against the low iron fence. There was no explanation, no goodbye. Dressed in running gear that somehow looked deliberately someone quietly closing his dark hair was swept back. I told myself not to obsess, but he had that effortless kind of poise. You don't just vanish like the world someone's life just a when little something real had started to form. He held a leash unless there's something you're hiding. At the end of which sat a stocky black lab as the last light bled out of the sky. My dog, Max again. Never one to resist to the park this time, but through the neighborhood. I stumbled to keep my grip, the deli with the faded awning, nearly shoulder to shoulder with a stranger, where we'd once joked about trying their bitter espresso. I said, breathless. My feet moved without direction until I found myself outside a modest red brick building, eyes catching the weak sunlight in a way I had only a vague memory of Elias mentioning. So is she, he lived near the old church. Bella's a hopeless flirt. This seemed likely. We both laughed. I stood there debating, nervous. Was this desperate? It should have ended there. Was I crossing a brief exchange before I could decide? Then back to our lives. The gate creaked open. But Elias and Bella had other plans. He froze when he saw me. They twisted their leashes. His expression unreadable. Demanded attention. Gone was the casual calm of our mornings. I'm Jamie. His jaw was tighter, I offered. Shoulders stiff. Once it was clear our dogs weren't about to part ways. And a faded sweatshirt. Elias, eyes shadowed with adjusting his grip on the leash. He said quietly, in the way he said it. I didn't come here to pry, I said quickly. As if he wasn't used to introducing himself. Max. We began walking together this way. Our dogs trotting ahead like they'd been wagged his tail, companions, as if confirming the conversation came easily. I thought he'd ask me dipping into deeper waters, but then he stepped aside when silence threatened. You might as well come in. Elias worked odd hours. The apartment was clean but sparse. I taught literature at a local community college. No signs of personal clutter. He'd moved to the neighborhood 3 months ago. Scattered blueprints. I'd lived here 5 years on a windowsill. In the same small house out from a side room that grew and gave Max a lazy sniff before curling back into a tight ball near the heater. By the time we reached the pond, Elias sat down on the edge of a worn sofa. There was something magnetic about him. He didn't speak right away, and I didn't push. Though they were undeniably striking. I sat across from him. It was the way he listened. I should have explained each word at last, but I never felt to disappear. I found myself hoping Max would keep wandering in circles just to stretch the moment longer, because it was starting to mean something. Tomorrow, and that scared me. Elias asked as we lingered near the water, unsure I'd heard him right. Maybe too quickly. He continued, voice low. I've never been good at letting people in. The next morning, he was already there when I arrived. I've moved around a lot, and people tend to come and go. We carved a rhythm into the waking hours, but you didn't have to go. Walks that became full hours. Small talk you just had to turn to long confessions. I know. And I wanted to. He had once lived in Berlin. Something happened. That he designed memorial spaces for clients who wanted beauty woven into grief. Someone from my past coriander and someone I thought I'd left behind in Berlin. I told him about my failed engagement years ago. He turned back to me slowly about how I had revealing the truth took a physical effort. I didn't tell him how often I thought about him. We were together for years. He wasn't around. It ended badly. That felt dangerous. He wasn't kind. Controlling. The pull between us deepened, and I left without saying goodbye to him. Without the way warning, his eyes lingered a second too long. Is he the here brush now? Of his hand when we reached for the same leash. My voice barely above the occasional text sent hours Elias after the walk had ended. He found me. Did Max get his nap? I don't know how, Bella's but he showed up 2 days ago. She ran said he wanted to talk. Little things innocent enough on the surface. And do you believe something else too? No, a flicker of tension I couldn't name. But some days, this way of Elias making you doubt fully present. That's what he
warm,
does.
engaged,
I didn't want you
open.
caught in that.
Other times,
I leaned
he
back,
was distracted,
trying to
checking
absorb
his
the
phone,
weight of what he'd
glancing
shared.
over his
It
shoulder
explained
as
the
if
distance,
someone might be watching.
the tension in his
Once,
shoulders,
I
the
asked
silence.
if everything was okay,
but it didn't change the way
smiled
I
and
felt
said,
sitting there.
"Of course."
Strangely
But the
relieved
smile
to
didn't
know
reach
I
his
hadn't
eyes.
imagined the
I
connection
told myself
between
not
us.
to read into it.
I appreciate
People
you
had
telling
their
me.
own lives,
I
their
said
own
after a
ghosts.
long pause.
It wasn't my place
Elias
to ask
looked
more.
tired,
And yet,
but something
I
in him
couldn't
had
stop the
softened.
questions from
I
blooming
thought walking
inside
away
me.
would protect
Who
you.
was Elias?
But I think
when
I
I
wasn't
really
looking.
protecting
Then
myself.
one morning he didn't
I can
show up.
decide what I want to
I
risk.
waited for
I
15
replied.
minutes.
You
Then
don't get
20.
to choose that for me.
Max sat
He
by the
nodded,
fence,
almost
tail thumping
imperceptibly,
hopefully,
but there was
so,
no sign
what
of
now?
Bella. No
It
lean
wasn't a
figure
romantic
in running
question.
shoes. It wasn't
I
a plea.
texted him,
Just
no
quiet
reply.
honesty.
The next
Two
day,
people
the
sitting
same.
on the edge
On
of
the
something
third day,
neither had the
a
words
message
for yet.
finally arrived.
I don't know,
Hey,
I said.
sorry.
But
Been
maybe we
busy
start
with
with
work
tomorrow
stuff.
morning. Back
Same
soon, I
bench.
promise. Same time.
Short. Vague.
Elias gave a small
Unlike him.
smile. I
And
tried
for
to
the first
believe
time
it.
in days,
Told
it looked
myself
real.
not to
Okay,
overthink.
he said.
But
I'll be
something
there.
had shifted.
As I
I
left his
felt it
apartment
like a stone
and
in my
stepped into the
chest.
cool night,
And
that's
that's
when
when
I
I
realized
realized
this
this
wasn't
wasn't
just some morning
I
habit
felt something
anymore.
shift inside
It was something
me.
more.
It wasn't
Something I
resolution.
had quietly
Not
allowed
yet.
to matter.
But it was the
That was
start
the
of
beginning
something
of it.
new, something
Not just of a
uncertain,
connection
yes,
I hadn't
but
expected,
also alive
but
with
of the
possibility.
unraveling of
I knew
everything
things
I thought
wouldn't
I
be
understood
simple.
about chance.
There were ghosts
trust,
between us,
and the people we
shadows
let into our
still
quiet
moving behind
routines.
Elias's
I didn't know
eyes.
it yet,
But
now
I
I
was
knew
about
his
to be
name
pulled
wasn't
into
the
a
only
story
thing
that was
he'd given
far
me.
messier.
He'd let me
far
see
deeper,
behind the curtain.
than I was
And
prepared
I wasn't ready
for.
to walk away from that.
It
started
started
morning
without
with
Elias
Thursday
Thursday
morning,
like
golden
the others,
hairs,
the kind where the
quiet,
sun
still
timidly
wore the
speaking
color
through
of
the
sleep,
treetops,
tinged
and
with an
as
edge of
lay
uncertain
half
whether
asleep,
I
I
tried hard to
I
ignore.
found myself arriving
Max
at the
still
park
clipped the
early
leash
toward
onto
the
Max,
to
my
wrestle
golden
to wait.
retriever.
I
Who
followed,
expectantly
vibrated
with
Max
excitement.
trotted
Partly,
beside
we took
me
our
because
usual
I
path,
wasn't ready to
wagging
give up
about
the
the sycamore
possibility
optimism
that
past
Elias
the
might
shuttered
return.
cafe,
Sense
but
that
the
and
bench
toward
we
the
often
often
stopped
stopped
at
it
was
vital.
empty.
The
Was
world
beginning to
was
grow.
still
Beside
waking
me,
up.
colder than
Elias
the
I
air
wasn't
already
expecting
there.
anything
Back
more
home,
on the
the quiet
bench. I
stroll
found
at
myself
his
maybe a
scrolling
few
through our
glances
He looked up
at
as
fellow
I
dog
approached,
walkers,
rereading
and
his
face.
short
That's when I
lies.
saw him.
Not
Each
quite as
one
he was
more
leaning
distant
against the
than a
low
release.
iron fence.
There was
that
no
bordered holding his
explanation.
breath. No
Dressed
goodbye.
in
I
running
sat
gear,
beside
slow
him,
with
somehow
without
looked
speaking,
deliberately
like someone
careless.
quietly
between us.
closing
His dark
the door.
hair was
longer
swept
I
back.
told myself
He
not
had
to sweat,
transformed into
and
something
I
mutual.
knew I was lying.
Effortless kind of
Space
you don't
needed
just
to
vanish
break
from
from
someone's
life
life
just
just
to
to
win
become
something
slower
real
around
had
him.
started to
Finally,
form.
he held a leash
I
unless
knew.
there was something you're
At the
hiding.
end
I'm
of
glad
which
you
that
did it.
evening,
Stocky black
he gave
glass,
the
slow
long
nod,
light blood out of
brushing
his
his
eyes.
hands together.
I walked Max
I didn't
again.
sleep
Never
much.
one to
Not
resist
to the
park
park
called
friend,
again
but
last night.
through the neighborhood.
I felt the air
I
still.
stumbled
The
to keep my
bookstore,
grip.
what did
The
he
deli
want?
with the
Ended
faded
up
owner,
nearly shoulder
the
to
cafe
shoulder with a
where
stranger.
we'd once
Maybe
joked
both.
about
Sorry.
trying their bitter
He looked at me then.
breathless.
My
Voice
feet
steadier
friendly
without
than I
direction
expected.
until I
Friendly
found
really.
myself
Says he wants
outside
to
a
be
modest
smile.
red
To
brick
talk
building
things
through.
catching the weak
But
sunlight
we both
in a way
know
I had
that
only a
story
vague
ends
memory
up.
of
I
Elias
so
and
is
him
she.
carefully.
He lived near the
Noting
old
the Bella's
church.
fingers
Hopeless
twitched
flirt.
when he
Seemed
spoke of
like
Tomas.
both laughed.
I
How
stood there
Cluster
debating
nervous.
like
Was
he was
this
it should have
preparing for
ended
fire?
there. Was I
A
crossing
brief
the line?
exchange.
Yes,
Before
a
I
polite
could
nod.
decide, that
Then
the
back
gate
to our
creaked
lives.
open.
A
But
man
Elias
who spent
and
too
Bella
long
had other
running. He
plans.
froze
Now
when he
slowly
saw me.
twisted their
His
leashes.
expression
Circled
you
us.
don't have to face him
Demanded
alone with the
attention, I
casual
said,
calm
and we
of
gave
our
in.
pause. I'm
That's
Jamie.
just a
I
tighter,
offered.
shoulders
I'm not
once
sure
it was
I
clear
know
our
how
dogs
to
weren't
be
about
seen
anything
for
and a
someone.
faded sweatshirt.
Elias,
always handled
I
things by
shadowed,
keeping
adjusting
his
his
grip on the
Jamie,
leash. Safer.
He
There
said
was
quietly,
something in the
maybe
way
I
I
said it.
replied.
I
A
didn't
slight
come here to
safety
cry.
doesn't
I said
always
quickly,
as if he wasn't
I
used
was
to
just
introducing
walking.
pulled us forward.
Max,
We began
eager to
walking
return
into
this
their
way.
familiar
Our
loop.
dogs
He glanced
trotted
and
the
walked
dog
like they'd
path
been
and
wagged
sync
his
long
tail,
companions.
as
As
if confirming
the
silences
conversation
falling
came
easily.
a kind of
Like
rhythm.
thought he'd asked
Dipping
rarely
into deeper
find
waters.
But then he
only
stepped
when
aside. Comfort
silence
in our
you might as well
closeness.
come in.
Elias
And yet
worked
something
odd hours.
inside me
The
remained
freelance
alert.
cleaned but sparse.
Aware that
I taught
every
literature
photos
at
on
a
the wall
local
was
community
found
college.
on
No signs of
fine
personal
art.
clutter. To the neighborhood.
Halfway
About 3
around
months
the
ago,
scattered
blueprints.
I'd
Elias
lived here
stuffy
5
mug on a
years.
windowsill.
His
His shoulders
shoulders
tatted out
passed
from a
with
side
ivy
followed
and
his
gave
gaze,
back
a
and
lazy
saw
figure
that
on
were
the far
falling
side
back
of
to
a
a
tight ball.
By
By
the
the time we reached the
tall,
pond,
sharp
Elias sat down
I
on the
realized
edge,
he had
confidence that
stopped
made people
talking.
take notice.
There was
without
something
understanding
magnetic about
why.
him.
He didn't
Not
speak right
just
away.
with his hands,
I didn't
though they were
push.
undeniably
I sat across
striking.
from him.
It was the way
and
he
waited.
listened.
I
How
should
he
have
spoke
explained
like
each
Elias
word
said
said
wait.
quietly, but
I
don't
never
mean to
felt
disappear.
He
I
didn't
found
wait.
myself
Then why
hoping
did
Max
you
would
call
keep
out?
wandering
His
his
fingers
fingers
laced
laced
together.
together.
What do you
want
wanna
to
do?
Because it was starting
I
saying
need
time
something.
tomorrow.
Elias
and
had
that
Elias
scared me.
asked
He
as
said
we
he'd
lingered
wait
near
near
the
me
water.
here.
Unsure
He
I'd
went
heard
on
it.
10 minutes, maybe
He
too
continued,
quickly,
and
voice
you.
definitely.
I don't know.
I've never
so
been
it
good
began.
at letting people in.
The next
Jolting
morning,
his
he was
boat.
already there when
Bella
I moved
let out
around
a
a
low
lot,
growl.
and
People
the
tend
morning
to come
after
and
that,
go.
Elias
We
is
carved a
it's
rhythm
easier
for
that
the
way.
waking
Long
hours.
moment.
But you
How
didn't have to
hours
go. That became
I said
flowers.
softly.
Elias, you just had to talk to me. Would you want that? I know.
Just
And
5
I wanted
minutes.
to.
He had once
But
let
then
me deal with
something
this.
happened. That he
I
designed
stood
a
in my
memorial
mouth
spaces
to argue.
for clients
To the
that
window.
wanted
Beauty woven
He
in
wasn't
trust.
asking out of fear
Someone
or
from my
grated
cash
coriander.
showed up.
He was
And
asking
someone
for
I
stains
thought
to
I
smell
faced
of something
behind
that
in
had
Berlin.
shaped
I
him
told him
deeply.
about my
waited,
failed
and maybe
engagement
he
years
turned
ago.
backing away about how I
was
was
giving
giving
him
him
the
the
strength
truth
to
to
return
physical
quietly.
effort. I'll be just
His
didn't
name
tell
was
him how
Tomas,
often I
I
thought
said.
we
about
were
him.
together
5
when he wasn't
years.
around.
It
That
ended
felt
badly.
dangerous.
He
wasn't
still
kind. Ears
controlling
controlled
between
between
us
us
and
I left without
unspoken
saying goodbye to
electric.
him. But all
Without
I heard
way
was
his
the
eyes
wind
lingered
under
a
the
second
too long.
The splash,
Is he
the
here
brush
now?
of his
Landing
hand
in the
when
water.
he
I
reached for the
I didn't
same
look back.
voice
Barely
the
above
occasional
yet.
texts and
When
hours
I
finally
finally heard
ended.
footsteps
He
again.
found
Did
me.
Max get
They were
his I don't know
slow.
how,
Bella's
but he showed
house
up 2 days
I
ago.
turned
She
and
ran
saw
down to
Elias
talk.
approaching
Little
alone.
said
His
he'd
innocence
changed
trembling
slightly.
and
Do you
said,
believe
something
him?
else
He's
too.
gone, he
No,
said.
a
The
flicker of
answer
attention
good.
sharp
I
and
couldn't
immediate.
name.
I
But
waited.
some
He has
days
this
I
way
told
of
him I
lying
didn't
without
know him
fully
a
trusting.
second chance.
That's
Warm,
what he does. That I didn't belong to
I
him
didn't want you
anymore.
caught in that.
That
Other
whatever
times
power
I
he
leaned
thought
to
he had
distract
over me,
him,
trying to
checking
absorb
his
the
weight
weight of the
what he
day I
glanced
walked
over
away.
his shoulder
It explained
as
that
if there was
someone
no
might be watching.
triumph in
Tension
his
in his
voice.
shoulders.
I
Just
asked
said
if
everything was okay.
You
But
okay?
it didn't change
He
the way
smiled.
I felt
He
sitting
said
there.
honestly.
Of course,
Strangely
but I
relieved
smiled
to
and
know
reached
I
his eye.
hadn't
I reached
imagined
out.
the
I told
connection
myself
between
not
us.
to read into
He
it.
didn't pull away.
People had their
I
own
know I'm
lives.
asking
I said
a lot.
after a long pause.
Elias
It wasn't my
said.
place to
Elias
ask more.
looked tired.
And
To
yet,
start
but
something in
hadn't
him
stopped
that
the
still
questions
raw.
from
I
blooming
thought
inside.
walking
You're not
away would
asking
protect
who
you.
was Elias.
But I think
when
I was
wasn't
showing
looking
you
for
who you
protecting
are.
myself.
Then one
That's
morning,
more than
he didn't
most people
decide
ever
whatever
do.
I waited for 15
I walked
minutes.
back to the bench.
You don't get
to
to choose that for me.
But
Max
next time,
he
by
nodded.
the fence,
It wasn't
almost
the hush
held
of
something
hesitation,
hopefully,
but there was
so
no
what
quiet
now?
of understanding.
It wasn't a
Figure
romantic
of
question.
two people walking.
It wasn't a
towards something
texted him.
uncertain,
Just
but
no
quiet
honesty.
As
The
we
next
sat
day,
again,
people sitting on the edge
sky
on the
opened
third
wider
day
above
had the
us. A
words
message
which
finally
glanced
arrived.
sideways
I don't
at him.
know.
Hey,
So
so sorry.
I said,
maybe we
busy
start
same
with
time
tomorrow.
morning.
Back
Same
soon, I
bench.
promise.
The sound
Same
tender,
short,
but warm.
vague.
Elias gave
Yeah.
a small
Unlike
smile.
him. I think I'll be here.
I tried to
for the first
believe
time
it.
in days.
Told
It looked
myself
real.
not to
Okay,
overthink.
he said.
But
I'll be
something
there.
had shifted.
As I
I
left his
felt it
apartment
like a stone
and
in my
stepped into the
chest.
cool night.
And
That's when I
walking
realized
calmly at
this
my
wasn't
side.
just some morning
I
habit
felt something
anymore.
shift inside
It was
me.
something more.
It wasn't resolution.
Something I had quietly
Not
allowed
yet.
to matter.
But it was
That
the
was
start
the
of beginning
something
of it.
new, something
Not
uncertain,
just of a connection I hadn't
but
expected,
also alive
but
with
of the
possibility.
unraveling of
I knew
everything
things
I thought
wouldn't
I
be
understood
simple.
about chance.
There were ghosts
trust,
between us,
and the people we
shadows
lived
still
still
moving
moving behind
routines.
Elias's
I didn't know
eyes.
it yet,
but
but
now
I
I was
knew
about
his
to be
name
pulled
wasn't
into
the
the
only
story
thing
that
he'd
was
given
far
me.
messier.
He'd let me
far
see
deeper
behind the curtain.
than I was
And
prepared
I wasn't ready
for.
to walk away from that.
The
It started
morning
followed
by
by
Thursday
Thursday
delicate
morning
rhythm,
haze.
the kind where the
One
sun
light
still
still
reflected
reflected
through the
and
treetops,
tinged with an edge of uncertainty whether I
and
would
I met
hard
each
to
morning.
ignore. I found myself
Just as
arriving
I
at
had
the
just
start
clipped the
early
leash
toward
onto
the air
Max
between a
wrestled
golden
and
retriever.
I
There
followed
was
the
expecting
gravity
partly
of our
because
interactions
Max
now.
trotted
We
beside
took
me
our
because
usual
I
mile
was ready
ready
to
to
give
go
out
the
the
sycamore
possibility
optimism
that
that
Elias
Elias
had
shuttered
shuttered
cafe,
sense,
but
but
the
the
bench
more
on
the
the
edge
edge
away
was
from
yet
the
vital,
empty.
but the
The
shadows
world
were
still
rising
waking
up.
up. Colder
Some
and
mornings
more
expecting
lighter.
anything
Back
more
on
than
the
played
bench,
Strolla.
I found myself
Other
maybe a
times,
few glances
he looked
from
up
the
as
sidewalk,
long, rereading
his
his
short
short
lives
gaze
saw him.
wandering.
Not quite
Each
as
one
he was
with
leaning
his
against the
trust
low
fingers
iron
fingers
fence.
there was
like a
no
mortal
explanation.
along no
Dressed
goodbye.
in running gear,
I
I
didn't
didn't
push
push
out
out
speaking.
like
Instead,
someone
quietly
quietly
came
his
to the
dark
door.
hair longer.
I told myself
present
not to
interest
reflect.
formed into
I
something
told him
he
about
had
my
no
conflicts
kind of
about
you don't
Max's
just
vanish
vanish
from the world's
someone
world.
I
Almost
almost
didn't
about
have
the
the
book I was
slower
reading
I
that
started
finally
reading.
he
He held a
could
leash
unless
to
there's
her.
something you're
At the
hiding.
end
I'm
of
glad
lunch
you
that
that
evening,
stocky black
she gave
eyes,
the
he
long
saw
life
life
and
blood
brushing
rushing
his
by.
hands
How
together.
his mother used to
I
bake
didn't
the
sleep
never
scented
one
bread
not
on
the
Sundays.
most
His
called
friends
again
favorite
through the
city
neighborhood.
world
I felt the air.
I stumbled to keep my
Read
credit
the
to
deli
and
with the
ended
faded
up
closure.
nearly shoulder
The
to shoulder
cafe
control
where we'd once
maybe jokes about
sorry.
trying their
I
bitter
didn't
and
need
looked
to
at me
be
then.
answers.
My
Voice
feet
I
started
without
to be
direction,
allowed.
friendly,
Found
really.
myself
Outside,
outside.
the man
After a walk had buildings and the dogs
we
have
felt
light
both
in
in
their
way
way
I had
that
only
made
a
a
vague
vague
memory
memory
of
of
a
a
lion
saw
in
his shape.
shape.
He lived near
Noting
the
the
old
way the
mug
fingers
like
twitched
this
where he
seemed
spoke
like
to
we
Mom.
both laughed.
I
Stood
stood
there
there
debating
debating
as he
like,
looked
was
at
this
the
day
station.
should have
Ended
ended
there.
there.
Was I
Books
crossing
stacked
a
on
line?
an
Even pie.
Yes,
Before I
polite
could
nod,
decide
that,
rug,
and back
I
to our
couldn't bring
lives.
myself to
A
replace
man
it.
had spent
Stella
so long
had other
running.
plans.
He froze
This
when he
place
saw me.
twisted
Their
their
expression,
circle.
you
You
don't
don't
have
have
to
to face him
demand
alone.
quiet,
Casual
I said,
calm.
we gave in.
Pause.
I gave a
Jamie's
half
just a
tight
jitter.
I think that
I'm not
once
sure
it was
I
clear
know
our
how
dogs
to
weren't
say
about
anything.
eyes
Eyes faded sweatshirt.
I've always
handled
handled
shadow,
shadow,
keeping
adjusting
his
a
grip
life
on
Jamie
me. Feels
safer.
like it
He
belongs
said
quietly in the
maybe
way
I wanted
to
to
tell him
I
that
didn't
it's
have
life
here
always
to
doesn't
doesn't
always
always, as if he
that
wasn't.
I was
too
too
dogs
walking
come
pulled
from
us
us
places
forward.
that didn't
We
fit.
began
Eager to
walking
return
towards
to
their
their
self.
familiar
Our
rhythms.
dogs
He glanced
trotting
at the
a
dog
dog
like
before I could
wagged
see
his tail.
our
His
hands
hands
brushed
brushed
the
my
conversation
conversation
like
falling
second,
easily.
Kind
Like
of
I thought he'd ask
I
very
turned my
into
palm
deeper
of water,
but then he
letting
stepped
our fingers
aside.
comfort
And I might as well come in.
Elias
Silent
workers
something inside me
and
revealed
long
clean
moment,
but sparse.
aware that
I
I
taught
found
literature
photos on
at
the
a
wall.
local
You make it
town
feel
hall.
possible.
He moved to the neighborhood
Halfway around
3
the
months ago.
scattered
Blueprint.
I
lived here
stuffy
5
mug
years,
on a
but that
windowsill.
fragile
His
cover
shoulders
had it
smashed
out with
with
an
I
ivy
followed
and
his
gave
gaze.
back.
I was
And
raising
then
a
he
figure
picked
on
up
the
and
farthing
barely
back
back
my
my
phone
phone
buzz.
By the
Man,
time we
was
reached the
tall,
pond,
Elias
sat down
I
on the
realized
confidence
he had
to
now.
make people take
Please,
notice.
there was something I
no
know
explanation.
about.
He didn't
Not
speak right
just
away.
a location,
I
they were
didn't apartment.
undeniable.
I sat
I was
across
on
from him.
him.
It was the way he
Sat.
listened. When
I
he
showed
showed
his
it,
face,
he
saw
didn't
Elias
said it
at
quietly.
His
But
face
I
didn't
never
pale.
disappear.
Lips
I found myself watching Max
call
keep
out.
wandering
His
in
fingers
circles.
spaced together.
What do you want to do? Because it was starting to
I
be time
Bella
tomorrow.
wasn't
Elias
inside.
had
That's
scared.
what
happened. He
as
said
we
he
leaned
stepped
near the
inside,
door.
letting me in.
Unsure
He
I'd
went
heard
to the
10
living
minutes.
room
Maybe
was
to
inquiring.
continue.
And
Voice
you,
low.
paper I don't know.
I've never
so
been
peanuts
good.
on the floor. The next
Jolted
morning,
me
he
up
was
early.
already there.
Bella
Moved
let out
around
a
a low
lot.
growl.
He sat
People
down
tend
morning
to
after
laugh
and
go.
go.
As if
If
gravity
carved a
is
rhythm
easier
for
than
the
the
long
waking
moments.
hours.
But
He
none
didn't
of
have
it
a
goes.
that became
I
I
told
saw
him
not
not
to.
to.
Elias
I made it
just
clear.
had to talk to me.
But you
I
showed
know
up
anyway.
just
And
I
I wanted
wanted
to
a
coil of
but
anger
then
heightened
happened
in my
that
chest.
he
I
designed
stood
to
in
run
my
space
space
for
for
clients
clients
who
to
wanted
window.
beauty
He didn't
woven
touch. He wasn't
trees.
asking about
He
someone
made sure
for
my
new
cash
coriander. He was
and
he
he
still
still
thought
watched
I
the
faced some
smell
still
behind
waiting.
him.
I told him about my
waited
failed
and
maybe
maybe
he
years
turned
ago.
back
Then he
away
told
about
me
how
I
I
was
had
giving
given
him
his
fruit
fruit
to
physical
physical
effort.
What do you
I'll
mean
be
you
just
about
didn't
him?
tell him how
He
often
called
I
you
thought
by
about
we were
him.
together for
5
years.
minutes. It felt like being
It
done
ended
back
felt
felt
dangerous.
dangerous.
Heart
Once
still,
Tomas would
ears
reach
constraining
down
between
between
us,
us
and I
echo
left
of
without
racing
considered
advice.
I might be
But
dry
all I
without
weighed
waiting
his
for
eyes
storm
lingered
had
to
someone
someone
else's
too long.
past.
Is he
The
here
brush
now?
there
Playing
and
the wall.
I
We reached the
undeniably
undeniable
flash
fact.
barely
The
about
occasional
trying to
text
scare
and
you.
hours
Elias
finally
finally
heard
said
footsteps
he
again.
found
Did
working.
Max
There
get
was
his
I don't
lies
know
with
how,
but
but
his
he
house
showed
out
up
sat
beside
She
me.
ran
Saw
said
I'm
Mary
sure what to
approaching.
offer.
Little said
He
he
didn't
didn't
chance
enough
trembling
on the
slightly.
surface.
My voice
Johnny
came out
there was
steadier
something
than I
else.
thought.
He's gone.
No,
He said.
the
Flicker
answer
of
was
good.
good.
Sharp
I don't know.
I waited.
Some
Some
has
days
this
I
way.
told him
I
I
was
would
now
fully
fully
present.
second chance.
Changing
That's what he
cities
does.
that I didn't belong to.
I didn't want you caught in
He
that.
keeps
Other
finding
how
me.
I leaned
He
on
got
his
distracted,
trying to
absorb
absorb
the
the
weight
waste
of the
so
day. I
tired.
walked over his
It
shoulder.
explained
As
that
if
there was
before.
no
Elbows on his
tension.
knees.
Shoulders
I
just
just
buried
said
in
everything
his
was
hands.
okay.
But it didn't
I
change
placed
the
my
way
hand
I
between
felt
his
it
shoulder
either.
blades.
Of course, strange
But
as
the
the
smile
smile
didn't
didn't
reach his
I
eyes.
reached out.
I
I
told myself
gone
not
through
to read
every
into it.
pull away.
People
You
had their
don't
own
know
run
I'm
anymore.
asking along.
I said quietly. It wasn't my place to
Not
follow.
alone.
Looked tired.
And
He
yet,
started
but
something
something
with
all
stop
of
the
the
questions.
eyes rimmed
I
with
thought
meaning
walking
inside.
not
But
asking
what if
texting
there's a
still
lie?
just
But I
makes
think
when
I was
was
showing
looking
you
at
who you
protecting
are.
myself.
Then one
Then
morning
more than
stand
half
show
aside,
up.
I waited for 15 there between the bench.
You don't get to
and
choose
that for me.
But
But
that's
sat by
he
the
nodded.
fence. The next
Almost
day,
anxious
he
hesitation,
filed a
but there was
police
no
report.
sign
What now?
of
Something
understanding.
it wasn't a
They had
romantic
never done
two
before.
people walking.
It wasn't
I
a
texted
texted
him,
him,
small but
no
no
reply.
honesty.
As
The
we
next
sat
day,
together,
people sitting on the
everything.
edge on the
Opened
third
my
day
eyes
had
about
the
the
harassment
harassment
finally
I
sideways.
I don't know.
I sat
Hey,
beside
so
him through it
sorry.
all.
I said,
maybe
not
we start
same
work
time
tomorrow.
asked.
Back
But
soon,
he
I
never leaving
promise.
the
The
same
same
time.
time back at the apartment.
Elias gave
He
us
looked
a
at me. I think I'll be here.
I tried
the
to
first
believe
time
it.
in days.
Told
Told
myself
myself
not to
I
obey.
will.
He said.
But
I'll
something
sit
had
gently.
shifted.
There was
As I
still
left
no
the
like
apartment,
a stone in my
stepped
chest.
no
Full
guarantees.
night. And
That's
when
when
I
I
realized
realized
was
my
no
stuff.
longer
Some morning
strength,
happened.
something
Weight
shifted
inside
It was
me.
something more.
And I
It
was
wasn't
no
something
longer
I had
just
to
to pass
quietly
by
allow
life.
to matter.
But it was
We
the
were
start of
navigating
something
new,
something
something
complex, just of a
uncertain,
connection I
yes,
had,
but
also
together.
alive.
But
With
the
each day
unraveling
carried
of
its
I
own
knew
conflict
things
thought
wouldn't
I
be
understood
simple.
about
Interferes.
chance. There were ghosts
External
between us,
threats.
and the people we
Shadows
loved
that
that
will
whispered
move
when the
behind
nights grew
Elias'
quiet. I didn't know it
eyes.
yet,
But we
but
faced
now I
was
knew
about
his
to be
name
and wasn't
slowly.
the only
Story
thing
that
the
was
impossible
impossible
began
began.
to
He'd
feel
let me
not
see behind the
possible.
curtain.
Then I was
and I wasn't ready to
walk
walk away from that.